Okay, we're going to go through Job 29 through 37. And then it's going to be 2 chapters with Job talking, and then have 6 chapters, I think, with Elihu talking. And then we'll be done with all the talking and we'll get to the God part. So, anyway, we're going to start with Job 29, and Job delivers a poignant reminiscence remnants of his former life, contrasting his past honor and intimacy with God against his present state of misery and isolation. This chapter is the first part of a triptych that includes his current humiliation, chapter 30, and his final protestation of innocence in chapter 31. Key themes of commentary: intimacy with God. Job begins by longing for the day when God watched over him. Commentators noted that this greatest loss was not his wealth, but the sense of divine communion and guidance, symbolized by God's lamp shining on his head. So this is what he missed the most, being in close relationship with God rather than all his wealth. Universal respect. He recalls his high social standing at the city gate, where young men withdrew out of reverence and even princes fell silent to hear his counsel. This highlights the loss of dignity he now feels while being mocked by those he once helped. So the same people he helped that showed him so much respect are now mocking him. Active social justice. Job refutes his friend's accusation of wickedness by listing his righteous deeds. He describes himself as an eye to the blind and feet to the lame, emphasizing that his authority was used to deliver the poor and break the fangs of the wicked. The nest of security in his posterity. Job believed he would die in his nest and multiply his days as the sand. Commentary suggests this reflects a common human tendency to assume current blessings are permanent, making the sudden fall even more jarring. Practical application. Many devotionals use Job 29 to define the Job 29 man, a leader characterized by his integrity, generosity, and a deep longing for God's presence. It serves as a reminder to value the spiritual relationship with God over material success and to use influence to protect the vulnerable. And so that's what he was. And actually, I think he was one of the most righteous men on the earth when Satan uh, picked him out. And Job 30 is a poignant lament where Job contrasts his previous life of high honor, recounted in chapter 29, with his current state of utter degradation and physical agony. The chapter is typically divided into 3 sections: his social humiliation, his perceived abandonment by God, and his intense physical and emotional suffering. Social humiliation 1 through 15. Job describes his complete fall from grace in his community. While he was once respected by the elders and nobles, he is now mocked by those on the absolute margins of society. The mockers. Job is derived by young men whose fathers he previously considered beneath even the dogs of his flock. So he thought they were totally, and now their children are mocking him. The outcast. He provides a vivid description of these people as children of fools and nameless outcasts who were driven out of society to live in caves and feed on desert shrubs. So these were the lowest of lows, given the hard time, is what he's saying. Cruelty and scorn. These people no longer show him any restraint. They spit in his face, trip him, and treat his misfortune as a song or a joke. And when you read this, it's easier to read it here because it's all in Hebrew parable where it's all repeated and kind of crazy. But in the second section, Job turns his attention to his spiritual crisis. He feels that God, once his intimate friend, has become his enemy. God as the oppressor, God feels God has unstrung his bow, thrown him into the mud, and is actively pursuing him like a storm. And so he thinks all these bad things are coming from God. Actually, it's coming from Satan. Silence from heaven. The most painful part for Job is that he cries out for help, but God remains silent and regards him not. Certainty of death. He is convinced that God's current treatment will inevitably lead him to the house appointed for all the living, the grave. So he's going to be separated from God for the rest of his life. Intense physical emotional suffering is 24 through 31. Job concludes by describing the raw, visceral reality of his condition. Physical decay. He describes his skin turning black and peeling off while his bones feel as though they are burned with fever. Scholars often link these symptoms to severe form of elephantiasis. Unending pain, his gnawing pain, take no rest at night, and he compares his cries to the mournful sounds of jackal and ostriches. Turn to mourning, his instrument of joy, the harp and pipe, have been repurposed for funeral dirges and weeping. Key contemporary insights. He's a type of Christ. Many commentators, including Matthew Henry, view Job's humiliation and mockery as a foreshadowing of the suffering and derived derision Christ endures during his crucifixion. So a lot of this Old Testament is pointing to Jesus Christ in the future. And he says, Father, why have you forsaken me? But the mystery of silence, commentaries often highlight that Job's greatest sorrow was not the pain itself, but the sense that his righteousness did not protect him from his fate and that God seemed indifferent to his cries. Foundational faith. Some modern studies emphasize that while Job expressed intense despair, his willingness to continue addressing God directly demonstrates a foundational trust that God is still the one who must ultimately answer. So he knew that God is in control and he's over all, and so he still has this faith in God. Job 31 is often called Job's great oath of innocence. It marks the final defense of his character before his dialogue with his friends conclude. In this chapter, Job uses a series of if-then statements to call down specific curses on himself if he's been guilty of various sins, thereby staking his life and reputation on integrity. Key things of purity and ethics. Commentators frequently highlight how Job's standards anticipate the teaching of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, focusing on the heart and thought rather than just the outward actions. Purity of thought. Job begins his covenant with his eyes, promising not to look lustfully at a woman. This is seen by many as a high watermark of Old Testament ethics. So this was the worst sin that he ever had committed at this time, and he's not going to do it anymore, he says. Compassion for the vulnerable. Job lists his active care for the poor, widows, and orphans. He even curses his own arm if he has ever used his power to oppress the fatherless. Rejection of materialism and idolatry. He denies putting his trust in gold, 24 through 25 are participating in pagan worship of the sun and the moon. That's 26 through 27. And so a lot of the pagan gods were actually the sun and the moon that they gave them names. And so that was the big two that they all worshiped. Job's final legal appeal. The chapter concludes with a formal legal appeal. Job signs his defense, literally his tav, the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and he demands that God, whom he calls his adversary or prosecutor, produced a written indictment. He is so confident of his innocence that he says he would wear such an indictment like a crown and approach God like a prince. So he's ready for whatever he did wrong. Job 32 introduces a new character, Elihu, a younger man who has been silent observer of the long debate between Job and his three friends. This chapter serves as Elihu's formal introduction and a lengthy apology for his bold decision to speak, marking a major transition as he attempts to moderate the dispute. And he really is kind of the moderator. He's not perfect, but he kind of has a little bit more common sense, the young guy, than his three other friends. And the rest of the chapters we're going to talk about tonight are going to be Elihu's chapters. Content and character of Elihu's genealogy. Elihu is the only speaker with a recorded lineage described as the son of Barachel the Bezite in the family of Ram. His name means he is my God, Elihu. The law, he speaks only after Job and his three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, have reached a stalemate and fallen silent. Twofold anger of Elihu. Elihu expressed deep indignation towards both sides of the argument. Against Job, he is angry because Job justifies himself rather than God, focusing more on defending his own innocence than upholding God's justice. I think he's right to get Job to focus on God rather than himself in this case. Against his friends, he is angry with the elders because they condemn Job without being able to effectively refute his arguments or prove his guilt. The source of wisdom. A central theme of the chapter is the source of wisdom. Age versus insight. Elihu's admits he waited out of respect for the elders, believing age should speak. Divine inspiration. He argues that true understanding does not automatically come with age, but is a gift from God. In a key verse, he states, "But there is a spirit in man, and the breath of the Almighty gives him understanding." So true wisdom comes from God. It doesn't come from the ages, and he's right there. Inner compulsion to speak. Elihu describes an overwhelming physical and spiritual pressure to share his perspective. Bursting like wine, he famously compares himself to unvented wine or new wineskins ready to burst, claiming he must speak to find relief. Sometimes when you get it out of you, you're going to feel better when you have this pressure inside. Promise of impartiality. He pledges to speak with total honesty, no flattery, fearing the divine judgment if he shows partiality. So he's talking good, and he's worrying about being right before God than before anyone else. Commentary perspectives. The mediator. Some scholars see Elihu as a type of mediator who prepares the way for God's eventual response, which we're going to have next week. The verbose fool. Other commentators are more critical, viewing Elihu as a pompous young upstart whose long-winded speech actually adds little that is truly new to the discussion. So he's got a different opinion, and why is he in here? Divine silence, notably when God finally speaks in the epilogue and rebukes his three friends. He does not mention Elihu at all, so God isn't holding anything against what Elihu said. And here's a quote from the verse 32, verse 8. But there is a spirit in a man, and the breath of the Almighty that gives him understanding. 33. The dialogue continues with Elihu continuing the conversation. After Job's three older friends fall silent, Elihu challenges both their failure to convince Job and Job's own claim of being pure and unfairly targeted by God. Key summary points. Elihu asked Job to listen fairly, position himself as a fellow human formed out of clay, so that God need not be terrified by him as he might be by God. So he's basically saying, you got to listen that you're just a man like me and God is God. Refuting God's silence, 8 through 14, he quotes Job's claim of innocence and accusation that God is a hostile enemy. Elihu argues that Job is wrong because God is greater than man and does not owe an accounting of his ways. He insists God is speaking, but people often fail to perceive it. God's methods of communication, 15 through 22, Elihu describes two primary ways that God speaks to humans. Dreams and night visions, used to warn people away from pride and preserve them from the pit, death. Physical suffering, pain on a sickbed is framed as a chastening or corrective discipline meant to turn a person back to righteousness rather than simple punishment. So sometimes it's to get you back to Christ, back to God. The role of a mediator, 23 through 28, Elihu introduces the concept of a messenger or mediator who can show a person what is right and intercede for them. If this mediator finds a ransom, God is gracious, restores the person to youthful health, and the individual joyfully testifies to others about God's mercy. Final appeal, he concludes by stating that God works these redemptive cycles twice, even three times, to enlighten souls with the light of life. Then he invites Job to respond or remain silent and learn wisdom. So he's trying to teach Job and just get him focused right. I think he's basically doing a pretty good job. Theological significance, Elihu's speech serves as a bridge between the flawed arguments of his friends and God's eventual appearance in the whirlwind next week. Unlike the three friends who viewed suffering as purely punitive, punished for past sins, Elihu views it as redemptive and instructive, a way for God to protect and refine the sufferer. The Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty has given me life. So that's one of the quotes from this chapter. 34, Elihu, the youngest of the group, delivers his second speech, primarily focused on a passionate defense of God's absolute justice and sovereignty. He directly challenges Job's previous claim of innocence, arguing that it is theologically impossible for an all-powerful God to act unrighteously. Key themes and arguments: the infallibility of God's justice. Elihu asserts that God cannot do wickedness and does not pervert justice. He argues that God repays every person strictly according to their deeds. Divine sovereignty. Elihu emphasized that God is sole sustainer of life. He points out that if God were to withdraw his spirit and breath, all humanity would immediately perish and return to dust. And I believe that's right. Impartially and omniscience, he declares that God shows no partiality to princes over the poor and sees every human step. Because God's knowledge is perfect, he does not need a formal court inquiry to judge someone. He can shelter the mighty without investigation. Accusations against Job. Elihu summarized Job's complaints, accusing him of claiming that he is without transgression and that it profits a man nothing to delight in God. He ultimately condemns Job for multiplying words against God and adding rebellion to his sin. So that might be a sin that he had, but it wasn't a sin that he went through all this punishment for. Elihu's counsel. Elihu suggests that instead of demanding a trial or asserting innocence, Job should adopt a posture of humble repentance, using a prayer such as, I have borne chastisement, I will offer no more, teach me what I will do not see. Here's a quote, therefore listen to me, you men of understanding, far be it from God that he should do wickedness and from the Almighty. 35. The fourth speaker, Elihu, continues his discourse by rebuking Job for what he perceives as self-righteousness. He challenges Job's complaint that there is no profit in living a righteous life if God allows the righteous to suffer. God's transcendence, verse 1 through 8. Elihu tells Job to look at the heavens and the clouds, noting that they are far above. He argues that human actions, whether sinful or righteous, do not directly affect God because he is independent and self-sufficient. Sin, if a person sins, it does not harm or diminish God. Righteousness, if a person is righteous, they are not doing God a favor or giving him something he lacks. So, interesting. But conclusion, our moral choices primarily impact other human beings, not the Almighty. And so I think he's pretty close. Unanswered cries, 11 through 13. Elihu addresses Job's frustration with God's silence. He explains that while many people cry out under oppression, God often does not answer because their pleas are proud or insincere. And he notes that sufferers often cry for relief from pain rather than seeking God, my maker, who provides comfort, described as songs in the night. Elihu labels these unanswered cries as empty talk that God will not regard. Final rebuke to Job, 14 through 16. Elihu tells Job that even if he cannot see God, he must wait for justice. He concludes by accusing Job of multiplying words without knowledge, claiming that Job's persistent complaints are vain and born of ignorance. 35, verse 5, look to the heavens and see and behold the clouds which are higher than you. 36, the young observer Elihu continues his final speech to Job, shifting the focus towards a grand defense of God's justice and the purifying nature of suffering. Core themes of Elihu's speech: the righteousness of God. Elihu describes as asserting that he speaks on God's behalf as to ascribe justice to his maker. He emphasized that God is mighty but does not despise anyone, being perfect in both power and understanding. Suffering as discipline, a key contribution of Elihu's argument is that suffering is not always a punishment for hidden sins, as Job's friends claim, but rather a corrective tool. He argues that God uses affliction to open the ears and call people to a repentance. And so this is true, and we aren't going to hopefully be chosen by God to be an example for Satan. And so when we get this, the key is to get back focused on God when bad things are happening. Two paths of response: the obedient. Those who listen and serve God will spend their days in prosperity and their years in contentment. The unrepentant, those who remain godless in heart and harbor resentment, will perish without knowledge or by the sword. God's sovereignty over nature. Towards the end of the chapter, Elihu describes God's control over the water cycle, rain, clouds, lightning, and thunder as proof of his unsearchable greatness. His natural imaginary imagery serves to remind Job that God's ways are far beyond human comprehension. Elihu's warning to Job. Elihu warns Job that he has become obsessed with questioning God's justice, which places him at risk of falling into the same path as the wicked. He urges Job to magnify his work and submit to God's authority rather than demand a legal trial. Here's the quote I picked: "If they obey and serve him, then the end of the days in prosperity and their years in happiness." And we know this is what's going to happen to Job at the very end. This is 37 in Job 37. Elihu concludes his four-part discourse by extolling the sovereignty and majesty and unsearchable power of God as revealed through the elements of nature. As a thunderstorm seemingly rolls in, Elihu uses the weather as a literal object lesson to argue that if Job cannot comprehend the basic workings of natural world, he has no right to question the moral governance of the Creator. Key themes and sections. The voice of the God in storm, 1 through 5. Elihu describes thunder as the majestic voice of God and lightning as his command sent to the ends of the earth. He expressed a personal physical trembling in the face of his powers, suggesting that such awe is only proper response to the Almighty. And so, having this awe, he's awestruck of God. He has a fear of God, the correct fear of God. Sovereignty over the seasons. He details how God commands the snow, rain, ice, and wind. Elihu notes that extreme weather can seal the hand of every man, forcing a halt to human labor so that people must stop and acknowledge God's work. Purpose of nature. Elihu asserts that God directs the clouds and storms for specific purposes, for correction, judgment, for his land, general sustenance, and for mercy, loving kindness. The challenge to Job, 14 through 20. Elihu proposed a rhetorical question to Job, asking if he understands how God balances the cloud or spreads out the skies. He argues that human ignorance, darkness, makes it impossible for anyone to draw up a case against God. Conclusion: the majesty of the Almighty, 21 through 24. Elihu concludes that God is beyond human reach, excellent in power and perfect in justice. He warns that God does not regard those who are wise in their own heart, effectively rebuking Job for his self-righteousness. This chapter serves as the final human judgment in this book, setting the stage for God's direct appearance from the whirlwind, chapter 38, which we're going to study next week. And God's voice thunders in the marvelous ways. He does our great things far beyond our understanding.